So good morning and welcome everyone. It's 10:02 and I would like to call this planning committee meeting to order. First question that we always need to ask is, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? I'm not seeing any hands rising or nodding of heads, so I will assume that that is the case. And just give me a sec here.
Do you ask the question of those members that'll come in late?
Yes, we can ask that question. Yes. I'd like to go ahead and adopt the agenda. It's been circulated, and may I have someone move the acceptance of the adopting the agenda. And I'll have Beth move that, and who would like to second it?
I will.
Peter. And all in favor? Show of hands. Okay, carried. Okay, so we are in our, we're formally into the meeting. What I'd like to do before we take any further steps, I just wanted to highlight for everyone that today will be the last planning committee meeting of this term of council. I've been informed by staff that we're stretching it a little bit to get planning staff to get us to this stage, and they are in a kind of a crash course, so to speak, to try to clean up the outstanding applications. And one of the things that we are going to be talking about, as you've seen on the agenda, is one of the requirements to ensure that we have applications at some stage of completeness, so that we can respect the timelines that the province is installing in our domain here. So I just wanted to let everyone know and just reaffirm that today will be our last opportunity to get together under this forum. However, we have an opportunity to get together again in the next term. And for those of you who haven't been watching like eagles the township website, the Mayor Coetzee and I and four other councillors have all been acclaimed, and the only ward of contention where there are 3 candidates is Ward 3. So we pretty much know who's going to be on council, except for one, and that contest will play out with an election on the 24th. Okay. Yes, Beth.
Does that mean there still is a lame duck council if you know with certainty, except for this one member?
So the definition that we have learned about council is when 75% of the council that exists are not returning or may not return, then we enter in a interim stage where you can call it lame duck. There's a variety of other words that people can use, but the essence is that we are precluded from making essentially large financial decisions. However, we can continue to conduct business mostly as normal. The financial decisions have been delegated to our CAO, Greg Marotti, and the reason for this number is if you look at the number of councillors, including the mayor that we have, which is 7, and we have 2 councillors who have indicated that they are not running for re-election. That puts us down below the 75% number, and that is what triggers this current state. So hopefully, I mean, if we can talk more about that at some other time, but that's just our current state that we're in. Peter.
So just a question about this committee. Will it continue under the new council, or does council have to formally constitute a new committee, and is there a formal application process to join the committee?
So the last couple of questions, yes and yes. So each committee of council lives within the context of the term of council and ends at the end of the term of council or a month or two earlier. And it needs to be reconstituted. And so the council will need to approve the existence of or the establishment of a planning committee, and we'll have to accept applications and then go through the formal process of assigning people to the planning committee and then going forward. So it's quite likely that we won't be really in much of a position to do much before January, maybe February. But I would certainly welcome all of you to be thinking about rejoining in the new term, and we will likely be in a position in December, maybe January, to communicate the need for applications and seeking new members of a planning committee, assuming council decides that we are going to have a planning committee. Those are all things that are beyond my individual ability to control, but that is part of council's decision.
Thank you.
All right, next step is adoption of the minutes. Have people had an opportunity to review the minutes? And if so, could I have someone move adoption of the minutes? I'll take moving from Ian and seconding from Peter. And all in favor? Excellent, thank you. So the next item on the agenda is topics of discussion, and our planning department consulting have prepared a couple of reports, and I'm assuming Jason or Jen, you will take over. Okay, Jason. So unless there's any questions, I'd like, oops, hold on. Bill, you had a question?
Sorry, no, I did not. I guess I see my hand up there, lower hand. Apology.
No problem. The joys of technology. So, Jason, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll just do a quick sound check to make sure that folks can hear me okay. I've been having some difficulty with my headphones lately, and has reduced the productivity in meetings as of late where I am involved. So just wanting to make sure that they work. So thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to sit and have an opportunity to chat with Planning Committee today about the two reports that are on the agenda. So the first report relates to Bill 109, and I think this links back to a discussion that Planning Committee began earlier this year. I think it was in either the late spring or the early summer, about Bill 109 and the potential implications of the legislative changes that were proposed at the time, I believe, in that piece of legislation, and their implications for service levels within the township in particular. So the report that Planning Committee has before it this morning basically picks up on that thread in the discussion from late spring. And what it does is it describes kind of, set some context by describing the government's sort of intent with respect to increasing housing supply within the province of Ontario over the next 10 years, talks about some of the changes that are proposed through Bill 109, and then focuses very specifically, I think, on two changes that are sort of very sort of topical for a lot of municipalities. The first is the graduated application refund fees, which we had sort of talked about, I think it was in the meeting that we had in the late spring. And the second is the increased authority around or mandatory delegation of site plan control decision making, which now councils throughout the province of Ontario are being asked to delegate, fully delegate decision making responsibility for site plan to staff. So the report describes those changes sort of in detail, provides Planning Committee with some additional information from our perspective on potential implications for land use planning services within the township. So from a graduated application fee perspective, as Chair Hazelton alluded to earlier, beginning on January 1st, 2023, municipalities that do not achieve certain decisions within certain decision-making timeframes as required under the Act will be required to refund application fees back to applicants on a graduated basis. So the report describes the sliding scale that's involved there. That does present, as we've talked about in the report, some risk to the municipality, both financial and reputational. And what we're recommending in the report, obviously, is that we bring forward a complete service level enhancement package to council, which will describe how the township can move from the sort of informal pre-consultation process that it has in place today towards a more formal pre-consultation process, bringing the township service level in line with service levels with other municipalities within the Muskoka district and other municipalities across the province of Ontario. The second aspect of the report then speaks to the delegation of site plan control responsibilities to staff, and the township today does delegate some authority for site plan control decision making to staff, both through its delegation bylaw as well as the site plan control bylaw itself. And so what the report recommends is, in response to the legislative changes that have been enacted through Bill 109, that we open up those bylaws at the council level, and that we further delegate all site plan approval decision making to staff as required by the legislation, subject to checks and balances in the bylaw, of course. So typically when you look at a bylaw where you're delegating authority from staff or from council to staff, excuse me, it's quite typical to sort of for council to place some parameters on the scope of the decision-making authority and to establish some checks and balances in the delegation bylaw to ensure that if staff encounter a situation where they require some direction from council, that they have the ability to go back and seek that direction from council. And similarly, an applicant that may not be satisfied with the outcome of a particular discussion or decision has the ability to come back to council to have their views known, and council can sort of, I don't want to use the term adjudicate, but I can't think of a better term right now, but council would have the ability to sort of adjudicate that sort of dispute between the applicant and staff. So that, Mr. Chair, is a summary of the report. We're here today to talk about these two changes with Planning Committee. We're quite curious to hear Planning Committee's views on the pre-consultation process on both aspects. In pre-consultation, we're very curious to hear Planning Committee's views about maybe pre-consultation processes that Planning Committee is familiar with that they think are really good examples of a pre-consultation process that works. That's, I guess, question number one. The second piece would be, as always, continued advice and guidance to us as the township's planning consultants on things to potentially keep our eye on as we're sort of embarking on that next conversation with council around moving from informal to mandatory pre-consultation. And then as it relates to site plan control and the delegation of authority, curious to get Planning Committee's feedback on that as well. And sort of focusing, I'm very much interested in understanding sort of the Planning Committee's perspective on what parameters council may want to consider placing around that delegation of authority. And curious to get Planning Committee's feedback on sort of appeal mechanisms back up to council. I think those are two things that we are very curious to hear about. Planning Committee may have other views, Mr. Chair, but I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions. Jen is here with me to sort of to assist with the conversation as well. So happy to take any questions and looking forward to getting some good feedback from Planning Committee. Thank you.
And nobody can hear me. So thank you, Jason. I would like to open it up to the floor for any initial questions that members may have that we want to put out there. Okay, Paul, and then Peter.
Jason, I just want to get clarification. So I agree with you that you should have pre-consultation on most issues. I'm not necessarily think all issues, but most issues. So if you insert a pre-consultation process, then you can declare the application complete, or do you have to do the pre-consultation after it's been deemed complete?
So through you, Mr. Chair, great question. It would be the former. So we would do the pre-consultation, the applicant would provide the required studies, and at that point in time, the township would be in a position to either deem the application to be complete or incomplete. if the applicant misses a key study that was identified through the consultation, that's the early consultation with staff.
Okay, and if I can have a follow-up on that. So should we do pre-consultations on every application or just certain applications? And where would the cutoff be if it's only on certain applications?
So through you, Mr. Chair, this is an excellent question, and maybe this one will generate some discussion. So two different pieces to this. So one is the Planning Act does mandate or does give municipalities the ability to require mandatory pre-consultation for what I would describe as major planning applications. So your official plan amendments, your zoning bylaw amendments, your plans of subdivisions, and your site plans. Pre-consultation for quote unquote minor applications like a minor variance or a consent or more up to the municipality. But given the nature of development within Georgian Bay Township and the nature of the applications that we see, I think I would look to Jen, but I think our recommendation would be we would require pre-consultation for all applications, including minor variances, given the significant role that those types of applications play in terms of facilitating new development within the township, the role that they have in terms of protecting the natural environment. So I think, Paul, we sort of look to cast a wide net in pre-consultation, all with the view of trying to make your land use planning process more efficient, more predictable, more open, and easy to understand. That's the long run goal here.
If I could just drill down on that just for 1 minute, like if I'm going to do I'm going to do something to my dock, and it's within the building planning requirements and everything else. It's all I need is a building permit. Do I need to have a consultation for that? Something that's already within the regulations and not a consent or a minor variance? Do I have to have pre-consultation on everything?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no. Pre-consultation would not be required in that instance. So if an application already conforms to the planning framework, then it would be basically the applicant would go to the Building Services Department, apply for their permit, and they would go through the OBC process.
So just to blurt in here, we'll get to Peter in a second. The expectation, I think, where Paul is getting to is that we would have a fairly clear statement of explanation of when a pre-consult was required, and where Paul is referring to simple things that really go straight to building without any other criteria, that they wouldn't need a pre-consult. Is that the intention that you would be bringing forward, that kind of clarity of direction, Jen?
That is the intent, Mr. Chair. Yeah, sorry, Jen.
Yeah, no, Jason and I are aligned. I just want to provide a little bit of additional context for Councillor Bianco. We're thinking right now that easements and simple lot additions might not require the pre-application process, because we usually wouldn't require a study or anything like that for those types of applications. And for the scenario you described where you meet all of the zoning and all of the planning policies, we're considering implementing a zoning certificate for that process so that it makes the building department's job a little easier. So that's a consideration that we're looking at with building, is how we can make it more efficient for the applications that don't need a Planning Act application.
Okay. Paul, any follow-ups or? No. Okay, I'll move on to Peter. Did you had your hand up next?
So I overall, I like the report. I like the pre-consultation proposal. I guess one question I have is with respect to staffing and being able to manage this, because the feedback I've been receiving over the last 12 months or so is that some of our members have been requesting a pre-consultation meeting and they haven't had one because of lack of staff. So, and this is all tied together with meeting the timelines, of course, but where are we at in terms of staffing, in terms of our ability to be able to follow through on this proposal if it's implemented?
Jason?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair, it's an excellent question, and Member Folds is correct. The township, as we've described in the report, has been somewhat challenged this year for reasons beyond its control and sort of meeting the planning service levels. The good news, as we've described in the report, is Council has made some substantial investments in planning service levels in the township earlier in the year in the spring, and those investments are beginning to bear fruit as we've described. So staff have managed to fully address all of the applications that are currently before the township for legislative decisions, so all of their planning act decisions, and now staff are moving to begin to engage on the pre-consultation applications, if I can describe it that way. And our hope is certainly by Q4 of 2022 that we are back to and operating at what I would sort of describe as a normal service level. Now, Member Folds does raise a good point. As the township moves from an informal to a formal pre-consultation process, there may be some service level implications for Council to consider in terms of additional FTE hours that would be required to achieve the mandatory pre-consultation. There'll be a bit of an overlap between the staff resources that are required to do the informal pre-consultation and this new pre-consultation model. But those are the details that we'll be working out with Jen and Greg and his team sort of in the coming months, subject to feedback that we get from Planning Committee today. Our intent is we would like to bring a report forward, I think as we've described in this report, to Council as soon as we can, with the tools to go from informal to formal, Peter. So the pre-consultation bylaw, what the application forms look like, what the process itself would look like in some level of detail, so Council can understand the service that the service level changes that we're proposing. And I would sort of expect at that time we'd be able to put sort of a fine point on what the FTE requirements would be to go from where we are today to where we need to go in the future. So we don't have that information yet, but that is information that will be coming in probably about the next 4 to 6 weeks.
And just to follow up to that, in terms of timing, as I understand Bill 109, the financial penalties will take effect as of January 1 and will apply to applications that are received after that date. So that, and I'm not sure what the definition of receiving an application is, whether that's the pre-consultation application or the actual post-consultation. But if do we need to be ready to have some formal pre-consultations before January 1st for the applications, the planning applications that are going to be filed after January 1st?
So again, through you, Mr. Chair, it's an excellent question. That, and yes, is the answer, and that's why we've talked about a soft launch and a hard launch in the report. So we'll probably soft launch the new mandatory pre-consultation process sometime in Q4 2022, with the goal of having that mandatory process hard launched on, I'm going to say Jan 1, 2023, but it will probably be a couple of days prior to that, just to ensure that we're meeting that legislative timeframe.
Thank you. Peter, any more?
No, that's all. Thanks.
Okay, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. I guess is one I saw. I guess in the analysis there was a fee associated with the pre-consultation, and I wasn't sure if that is something that is necessary in all applications. In that there are fees associated with the, I guess, the planning process, whether it's a zoning bylaw amendment or minor variance. I think I guess the enforcement or application fee for the pre-consultation to me seems something that we should sort of look at and decide whether or not it's something that we want to impose on those applicants bringing those planning applications to the planning department. The other, I guess, is, Jason, is a minor variance. Is that part of this sort of timing, and that would relate to sort of refunds, et cetera, if we don't sort of complete the process? It looked like with zoning bylaw amendments, the zoning bylaw and official amendments, minor variances included for the penalties?
So through you, Mr. So Member Davis faded in and out a little bit for me, but I think I got the gist of the question there. So two pieces. I'll start maybe with the first observation around the pre-consultation application fee itself. So for planning committee's context. So some municipalities do require an application fee for pre-consultation, and some municipalities have made the choice not to require a pre-consultation application fee. In the cases where a municipality has chosen to require a fee, typically it's a very nominal fee that is associated with the pre-consultation application. And most municipalities will actually, if an application is made within a certain time frame, say 6 months of the pre-consultation session or 9 months of the pre-consultation session, what the municipality will actually do is credit the pre-consultation fee towards the subsequent application fee. So that way, there's no additional financial charge to an applicant, if you will. And of course, that's all within a much bigger context around or conversation around application fees and fees for service versus taxpayer-funded services. But those are, I think, conversations for council as it's going through its budget discussion and what service level it's trying to achieve and how much of that service it's looking to pay for, either on an application sort of basis, on a fee basis model versus a taxpayer basis model. Now, the second point to the question, I think is variance, because when you look at the graduated application fee refunds, they're targeted towards those major applications, which the legislation requires mandatory pre-consultation. So there's an alignment between this idea and the legislation of municipalities should be requiring mandatory consultation, and then these refunds that come along through sort of Bill 109. The municipality, notwithstanding that, I think is earlier, it does have the ability to require informal pre-consultation on minor variance applications. That's certainly our recommendation, because minor variances sound like very small applications, but sometimes they can be quite complicated, I think, as members of the Committee of Adjustment would probably sort of attest to. So, and I think that would be helpful for staff, generally speaking, and it would be helpful for the decision-making process within the township. But to the question around the refund, sorry, this is a long answer to a short question. The question around refund is it isn't mandated by the legislation. So the municipality is protected in that regard.
So under a minor variance, there are not refunds.
Are not.
Because me and Cognition, most of the applications, planning applications, are that of minor variance. Or not as many that we come through Cognition anyway that are applicable to the refund process. I guess the other thing I was going to ask, only because they clear and not clear, but the delegation of the site plan control to staff. Can you give me a number of examples of what that site plan control could be, and whether or not there are things that could create some issue with the community in that delegation?
Sure, happy to. So through you, Mr. Chair, I think committee understands sort of the concept of site plan and what goes into a site plan drawing. And as we talked about it several months ago, as we talked about site plan, right? It is the tool that the municipality uses to ensure that development is appropriate within the township. And the advantage of a site plan control approval is that you can register the agreement against the title of the property, and you can ensure performance of the site plan over time as property owners change, 10, 20, 30 years into the future. I'll lean a little bit on my past experience, if that's okay, in terms of answering the question. So in my former role, I think as planning committee knows, I was the director of planning for a mid-sized community in Ontario. And in that case, staff did have fully delegated authority from council to make site plan control decisions on their behalf. And in making those decisions and in the delegation, it was a full delegation of authority that had been in place for quite some time, well over a 10-year long period. So a very well-established process, if you will. And in that case, staff, when making their decisions on site plans, made those decisions both in accordance with the official plan, obviously the zoning bylaw, and any other relevant policies and procedures that the municipality would have had in place that would come to bear on any particular application. And in that case, the system was set up in such a way that two directors within the organization were actually responsible for approving the site plan. So you had a check and a balance from an administrative perspective, that the site plan had been through sort of two sets of eyes, if you will. And in that particular case, and in other cases, we always maintained a right of referral back to our council if we were in the midst of a site plan approval and a disagreement emerged between staff and the applicant, say around the application of a policy or the application of a standard. So a really good example would be standards around stormwater management and the imposition of those standards on a site plan, especially when those were new standards. So often we would encounter, I don't want to call it resistance, but we would encounter some friction in that discussion, and we would subsequently take the application back to council and say, here's where we are, here's the standard, council, that you've approved as it relates to this development. In attempting to apply this standard to this site, we've come up with the following situation and the following issues, and we need your guidance on how you would like to proceed in this particular instance. So should we be requiring, in the case of stormwater management, 80% total suspended solid removal on this site from a stormwater quality perspective? Or council, would you like us to look at a lesser standard? So council could help us then in the administration of that sort of approval, if you will, and then subject to whatever direction we had received from council, we would continue the conversation with the developer and the applicant. We'd eventually approve a set of drawings and agreement, and that would get registered against the title of the property. So it is important to have a relief mechanism back to council in the delegation of authority. And working with other communities on similar questions more recently, the feedback that we've received in those communities from their councils in particular is, we're delegating the authority. In delegating, we don't want to be making the decisions, and council wants to place very clear parameters on what comes back to them and how it comes back to them. And in some cases, the council wishes to hear that information. In other cases, councils wish to direct that to a committee of council for determination. So it can happen in a number of different ways, and I suspect this is going to be some of the discussion that we're going to get into council when we bring our report forward around the delegation on the site plan. So the referral back is a great tool. It's a great tool for the applicant. It's a great tool for staff. It's a great tool for council. We just need to sort of consider how that will sort of apply within the context of Georgian Bay Township, I believe.
Thank you. I guess ultimately then, Jason, there'll be sort of a roadmap for then planning staff that gives them that sort of authority to make those decisions. And outside those decisions, they would then go back to council for discussion.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Bill, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My internet seems to be a bit in and out, so I hope people can hear me. On the matter of pre-consultation, I think it's, in a way, it's excellent that applications in general is to support the application. And so this provides an opportunity with various levels of complexity. I mean, that meeting could be short and sweet for a simple application, but clearly to go through the list of study requirements, the applicant and whatever consultants are involved, opportunity to ask questions and for the application.
Bill, we're missing much of what you're saying.
Don't know. I think it's related to my internet connection, so I don't know what I can do about it.
maybe you could try turning your video off and just
Yeah.
trying the audio.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah, okay, sorry, is that?
Not a big improvement.
I guess just generally, I think it's a good idea to have the pre-consultation and for staff to trained in sort of being flexible about you know, how lengthy or complicated that is, so that it can be varied depending on whether the application and the study. So that's all I need to say about that. Thank you.
Jason,
If you
Jen?
have any additional notes, you can put it in the chat as well, and we can read it out loud if you would prefer that way.
Right, okay.
So Jason or Jen, I think what Bill was trying to get at was introducing staff flexibility and ability to handle things differently depending on the set of expectations or complications needed. And I'm assuming that that's going to be baked in, but could you just confirm that?
Yep, that's 100% correct. So in some cases, you can have different degrees of pre-consultation based on application type. And then the other piece to this is through practice and through the practice of implementing the pre-consultation process. You know, staff feeling empowered will be able to apply those judgments in each and every case and then to make those decisions. The other thing, of course, that we've talked about in our report, which we are working on right now with Township staff, Jen is obviously leading all of this work, is the creation of the Development Application Review Manual. So, you know, as part of that process, we're looking to bring greater consistency to the administration of land use planning services within the township. And so those policies and procedures would be documented for the pre-con process. And over time, we will achieve, I think, the flexibility, the certainty and consistency that everyone is seeking.
So is that Development Application Review Manual, the short form name, is that the guidebook that Jen was talking about earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
We call it different things. Sorry.
Just try to confuse us. Yes. Okay, Beth, I saw your hand up. Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, a couple questions on the the report related to Bill 109 and this development review manual that is being worked on. Is that manual going to come back to this planning committee before implementation for input?
Jen?
Hi, Beth. So my intention is that it's an internal guidebook, but I think parts of it should come to committee. So that would be all of this pre-application consultation aspects, because that's a new procedure. A lot of the guidebook is going to be, you know, this is what a minor variance is. These are the 4 tests of the minor variance. So stuff like that. I don't want to waste committee's time. And a lot of it is, as you're aware, Beth, and members of the committee, there's a lot of complicated official plan and zoning application in Georgian Bay for all of the different waterfront communities. So a lot of the guidebook is just, here's the situation in Cognisheen, here it is in Wawatasi. So I could bring that to committee, but it's sort of just a copy and paste of what's in the OP, just an easier to follow format. But where I think it would be really helpful is around pre-application consultation, and in particular, the complete application requirements. So we're looking to change those. One example is for pre-applications, we want to see site photos from the applicants, which right now we don't get. That would be something that we'd like committee's feedback on, and some of the institutional knowledge that the whole team has on how we can ensure that we have complete applications so that we don't run into some of the issues that we've been running into in the township when we go to assess the applications.
So I'm really happy that this report is on the agenda, because I did sort of bring it up when Bill 109 was sort of in commenting period. And one of the things I raised at that point was the uniqueness of all of the properties in the coast and throughout the township. And perhaps the site visit is something that is important. I hear you say site photos, Jen, but site photos give one perspective. They don't necessarily give a whole perspective. Aerial photos are important. aerial photos over different water levels, particularly on coastal applications, is important. The whole issue of access and ability to gain access, is the waterway navigable to get to a property? Is that something that's properly conveyed in a photo? I would think not. You actually need to know that there's proper depth to get a barge to construct. So I think a site visit is a very important aspect of it. And we, as you know, have a number of applications that come forward in the dead of winter when staff can't go out and conduct a site assessment, and recommendations are sometimes made for approval that aren't necessarily appropriate. So I'm wondering if a site visit, obviously not for an urban context, but for a coastal related property, might be something that's important to put in part of a pre-consultation. And maybe it's even before the pre-consultation is initiated, because the whole idea of the pre-consultation is to determine the supporting studies that are needed for an application to move forward, to study all the various things that are already outlined in your OP. You won't necessarily know what those are unless you actually have a true understanding of the physical characteristics of the property, the water body on which it fronts, the depth of the water body on which it fronts. And I think all of those are important and would only be captured in a site visit versus just a site photo.
Yeah, so that's helpful feedback, and that's part of why we want feedback from committee before we do our hard launch. So hopefully the soft launch will find these issues, and then by the time the hard launch comes in, we'll know. And our intention is to front load all of an assessment essentially. So that could or could not include the site visit. We'll have to see how it all shakes out with everybody's feedback, but that is something that's on our radar.
And one of the other, I'd say, concerns we've sort of had historically is M&R actually consulted as part of through the pre-consultation process to determine what studies are necessary? And what we've seen in the past is, a planner may look at a fish habitat map and there's nothing mapped. Don't look at the aerial to see that it's shallow and weedy. And fish habitat studies haven't necessarily been required. And there have been some applications where M&R has said, yes, indeed, a fish habitat study is essential. So will M&R be part of that pre-consultation process? I mean, I know that it's taking a little bit more of a back seat these days, but they certainly have the expertise and have weighed in when they haven't been asked to weigh in, and have had serious concerns on some of the applications in our township that have come forward to council.
I see Jason's
did you want
hand is up.
No, I'm thank you, and I'm smiling because I wanted to jump in on the other point. But to answer the question about M&R, it's a very good point, Beth. We will, I think, reach out to colleagues at the MNRF and speak with them around how they would like to be engaged within this process, understanding that will also be involving the district, and then understanding at a higher level that we're functioning within the municipal plan review system and not the one window system, where the role of the MNRF is to provide the township with technical information, as opposed to providing the municipality with opinion advice. That opinion advice should be coming through the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing as part of that one window service that the province provides. It's a good point. We'll follow up on it, I guess, is the point of the answer. But your other point around site visits, we've talked about that in the past, and you make some excellent points there as well. And I think that goes back to what Member Folds was getting at earlier around service levels. So how much staff time will be required in order to implement the new mandatory pre-consultation? As you've been talking, I made a little note of myself to include site visit as an option for council's consideration as part of that pre-consultation process. So council can decide, do they want to have mandatory site visits as part of pre-con? If so, based on the activity levels that we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years is probably what we're going to benchmark the service level change against. What would that mean from an FTE perspective? And then the other point that you raise is, in the winter time, how do we address those sort of applications that would be on the coast, right? And how do we begin to get those perspectives? So that Beth, it's really good feedback. Leave that one with us for a little bit, but I could see definitely the option for the site visit being a service level enhancement option that we would propose to council with some clearly defined parameters on what the cost associated with that service would be.
So if I could just draw your attention, both Jason and Jen, the minutes that we circulated from our May meeting, pages, I guess, pages 3 and 4, had several statements in there that related to things that we would encourage to be included in the pre-consultation. Site visit was explicitly called out. Septic suitability was explicitly called out. The further on that page 4 was ability for the property to be accessed in all water levels. And so the committee has already kind of offered opinions on those kinds of things, and I'm not seeing them reflected in the current wording that you've got here. Perhaps that's kind of needing to get to a more detailed level, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of what had been previously discussed at the committee. And I'm going to get to another couple of members here in a minute, but just from a process standpoint, I hear the words that you'd like to get this back, the development application review manual or guidebook or whatever, back to committee for discussion, review, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, we are not going to have another meeting prior to the next term of council, and we probably won't be diving into new business until January or perhaps February. And so what I would suggest is there is a lot of passion for these topics from the members of the committee, and I am certain that if you were to share via email draft documents to each of us, you would probably get 80% of us offering comment back to you in an unofficial manner, but I think the value of the comments would be very very useful. So can I ask that you consider that approach, given that we won't have a formal planning committee meeting prior to likely when that document needs to be tabled?
Sure. Yeah, we think it's an excellent suggestion. I'm happy to follow up on it.
Thank you. Okay, Paul, you had your hand up next. Sorry, Beth, did you want to keep going?
Well, I was just going to, because remember Wienko asked a question earlier, and just so that it's clear that the time clock doesn't start ticking until you've concluded your pre-consultation process, you've prepared all your studies, and you've submitted all of the studies that were determined through that pre-consultation process. That's when the clock starts ticking. So I think, from Paul, from your question, I wasn't sure whether you'd understood when the clock starts ticking in terms of the refund. So maybe, Jason, you want to just confirm that or elaborate on it, or?
No, so through you, Mr. Chair, Beth is 100% correct. Timeframes in the Planning Act do not begin until the municipality deems an application submitted to it to be complete. So that would be an application. And will there? Sorry, Beth, that would have proceeded through this process.
And so will the township then issue a complete application certification? I mean, all other municipalities do. I mentioned this at the last meeting that I don't think I've ever seen one. Maybe they are, but not seen one issued from the township, because that's when that's the record of when the clock starts ticking.
Yes.
Excellent. Beth, did you want to keep going, or?
I wanted to make a comment on the delegation of the site plan approval, only in that, and I don't know how to put this so sensitively, but we've had a varied history of planning managers in this township, have not always been aligned with the concerns of the community or desires to protect the environment. So there may be some areas where council might want to direct staff to involve them on particular applications or issues that are sensitive to the coastal waterfront. So that I know you've said that is an option, and maybe it's something that can be considered rather than having all approvals within the purview of staff for site plan approval.
So if I could paraphrase a little bit here, Jen, you're working on a guidebook that deals with when to deploy OP statements for consideration for applications. I think what Beth is getting at is we need a similar guidebook from an from a site plan perspective of when site plans should be directed for further review beyond the planning department for consideration of the key strategies we have in our township. Is that something we can build in?
Yeah, that would all go to council. Like Jason mentioned, we'd go to council with a report on when they might want to see a site plan or what the appeal mechanism is. So Jason, you can hop in, but council will see it before it's enshrined in my little book.
Jason, did you want to expand on that?
Paraphrasing.
No, you forgive me for smiling and laughing. I agree with what sort of Jen is saying. I'm laughing because yes, it is beyond the manual itself. It's the delegation of authority in the amended site plan control bylaw, but Beth, you raise a good point as well. And what we're talking about through the legislation is it's important to remember is the delegation of the decision. The municipality has the ability to structure whichever process it chooses to structure to arrive at the decision itself. So I think there is some flexibility there to create some checks and balances within the system, in particular where council wants to have some oversight, say, and perhaps some input into an application prior to a decision. So I think those are reasonable suggestions.
Thank you. Paul, you've been waiting patiently.
Well, the more I hear, the more confused I get. But first of all, I'm all in favor of giving the planning department more latitude. For years, we've had them too many of them in handcuffs and not being able to do anything because of lack of clarity and direction from council. But I like the idea of the pre-consultation and all that. I think the key here is when does the clock start ticking, and that decision has to be made by a senior planner, which we presently don't have, and hopefully we'll get some in there soon enough. But the senior planner has to sign off as to when the clock starts ticking, and in the pre-consultation period, it's got to be made quite clear what studies have to be done, et cetera, and it's all have to be written out and so on. So I think that can be made quite clear by the planning staff. And I firmly believe that any time that planning staff is working on an individual application, that individual should pay the full shot. I don't think individual taxpayers wants to pay for other people's applications. So I think all the time they spend should be charged. But in order to have an application or considered complete, there's a number of things that have to be done, and site visits may be one of them, and maybe solely one of them. And so we should have a checklist of all the things that could be done, not necessarily have to be done, but the senior planner should have some kind of latitude to say, okay, we will do these, this, and this. And when it's done, then the application is deemed complete and some kind of form letter is sent out. So getting back to what I'm trying to say is basically, I think the planning department needs to be given more latitude, especially if we do come up with a manual, and let them do their job and get council off their back. And if they follow the manual and follow the ticking marks and ticking things off, I think we have something that we can actually use. Too many applications are coming to council, and we're making too many decisions, and we're not consistent in our decisions. So that's where we need to work on this manual and so on. So I'm all for it, as long as we eventually agree that senior planners make some final decisions.
Thank you, Paul. Before Peter, I'm going to ask our CAO, Greg, to pipe up. He has got his hand up there.
Yeah, morning, everyone. just wanted to make a couple of comments about the clock ticking, and so if the clock starts ticking, and we also have to include council on some decisions as part of the approval process. I just want to clarify: would any applications come to council before the clock starts ticking, or does council have to be involved once the clock has started? That's my first question. And the second one is, we all have to be mindful that the province is basically mandating delegation of certain authority to staff. So we want to be careful when we start having some creep in the scope whereby council then becomes too involved to the point where the applicant will then themselves take staff and council to task in terms of whatever tribunal process they may want to pursue. So kind of one's a question and the other one's a comment.
So Jason, Jen, who wants to field this one?
I think, so through you, Mr. I'll take a first shot, and then Jen can supplement if my answer doesn't meet her expectations for what my answer should meet. But I think Greg raises some really good points around the balance that you're trying to create within the system, maintaining the intent of the legislation in a very efficient approval process. So I wanted to acknowledge that. But then secondly, to get back to the question, I think there are different ways that we can define the service, Greg, to maybe even provide council with an early look on an application that has come in and been sort of deemed complete, to sort of see if they have some comments on it. I need to give some further thought to that, but you're right, the site plan decision-making timeframes are quite tight under the Act. The theory in the Planning Act is, by the time that somebody gets to a site plan application, it's a conversation between the applicant and the municipality, and it's a fairly straightforward sort of matter. So point well taken. I think, Mr. Chair, we just need to do a little bit of thinking on our end to sort of create a service that achieves both objectives: the ability for council to have an opportunity to be aware and to provide some input and some comment, together with creating efficient decisions.
Thank you, Greg and Jason. And if I could just kind of ask you to expand on that one little bit. There are site plans for commercial properties and there are site plans for residential properties. It would appear, or would appear to me anyways, that there may be a need for different strategies for each. Could you give us a kind of a glimpse into what you're thinking on those two fronts?
So this is perhaps where I'll defer to Jen for some of her thinking around sort of the implementation. But it is possible to create different processes for different land use types. My only caution would be, is you're creating different processes for different land use types. That does have the potential to create some confusion for your approval stream and sort of the process that needs to be followed consistently and regularly. So over time, that knowledge would sort of come, but just something that we need to be mindful of as we're creating a service. It isn't a hard no, but it's just something that we need to be mindful of. Jen, do you have any thoughts on the difference between commercial and residential there?
Thanks, Jason. I think we would definitely recommend that the residential for single detached waterfront stay with staff. Just the volume of it is such that it would bog council down. When it comes to commercial, I'm a bit ambivalent on it because we don't get so many that it would bog down council. I just, as we've seen with the only commercial site plan I've been involved in, I think the applicant has run into frustrations around the complete application requirements and navigating council. So I think one consideration is, are we meeting the intent of the province's direction to remove some of the red tape if we keep all commercial site plans, or is there an opportunity to kind of take an approach that Beth suggested, where it's not specifically the land use type that defines whether it goes to council, but rather an environmental risk or proximity to a PSW or something like that might trigger council's attention. So that could be something that we can write, we can go option A, option B, and council can make a decision which way they want to go. While keeping in mind, like Greg and Jason have said, the intent of the province is to get these things moving.
Thank you, Jen. I would like to come back to that in a minute, but I want to ask Peter to weigh in on his questions. He's had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments. The first one dealing with the development review manual. Just to say, I was going to make the same suggestion that Al has already made, that as a member, I'm offering my services on an informal basis to comment on the draft, if that'll be helpful. And I think one of the areas in particular where that might be helpful is, as you say, Jen, in outlining the specifics that relate to a particular community, because it is very complex, and it's all over the OP, and it's all over the zoning bylaw. And some of us who've been working with this for a number of years and have some local knowledge might be able to just make sure that we've managed to capture all of those peculiarities in the manual. The other comment I have is with respect to the standard conditions for consent applications. And here again, as Al points out, we're probably not going to have a chance to discuss this formally as a committee between now and next year. And again, it might be something that you want to seek some informal input on. I just have a couple of general comments on that. One is that, as Beth has pointed out, so many properties in the township are unique that I think it's good to have a list of potentially standard conditions, but I think the planners also have to think beyond that with respect to each specific property. And it may be helpful and you may want to break down your standard condition list depending on the type of property. For example, a waterfront or a water access and waterfront property may have a different list of standard conditions than an inland property, and so on. And this goes back to a lot of what we were discussing at our last meeting. And I think the reason Beth raised this in the first place, or one of the reasons, is it's important to identify upfront what conditions and what reports are going to be required, because that's going to determine when the clock starts to tick with your complete application. And you know, maybe I don't need to say this, but and maybe it's self-evident, but I think as a general comment, my own view is that list of standard conditions, and it might be a checklist, is really a reminder for the planner to address their minds to things that might be required, and the importance being to address the provisions in the OP and the zoning bylaw with respect to environmental concerns, but at the same time, it shouldn't be, we don't want it to be an obstacle to development. In other words, we don't want conditions that go beyond what is needed to address those environmental that are in the OP, that are in the provincial policy statement, and other concerns that are relevant to the particular property and planning issues. And I'm sure you're well aware of that, but I think it's a question of striking a balance to make sure that the issues that we need to address are addressed, but at the same time, keeping in mind that we want to maintain some level of efficiency in the planning process.
Jen, did you want to comment? You're on mute. There you go.
Sorry. Peter, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that's sort of the standard consent conditions were the genesis of this whole manual for me, which originally I started just as like an internal thing for me. So when we were writing reports, I was like, okay, what did we do in the past? What are our standard conditions? When do we apply X and when do we apply Z? So that's already written, that part. in the manual, but that is in there. So you guys will see it when I email it out. But also, I'll just kind of outline how I see the pre-application consultation process going, because I think there's a little bit of confusion how it would work. So an applicant would submit an application for pre-con. So they'll fill out our little form. They'll include everything we ask for in the form, which at this time I'm thinking is site photos, a survey if they have it, a description of what they want. Because right now, sometimes we just get like build garage and we don't know what that means, where they want to propose it. We get nothing. So something so we can actually provide a meaningful analysis for them. We would take that in. If council puts it in there, we would do a site visit. Right now, we do a site visit as part of all actual applications. So this would just be front ending it. So that would, as Jason sort of hinted at, that would be part of council's consideration for setting the fee for the site for the pre-applications. Then staff would circulate that out. So right now, this isn't happening. The district, for example, doesn't see it until it's a real application, and we're circulating it. So we will start circulating as part of pre-con. So we want the applicant to be aware of what the district has to say, if required, like what the Trans Severn Waterway has to say, what the Cottage Association's feedback is potentially, and just get a little bit of additional help so the feedback is more meaningful. Because we have situations now where, say it's an urban severance and they're looking to create a lot, and we give them our feedback, but the district hasn't been involved. So everything for municipal servicing, which typically a standard condition is that that new lot is connected to the municipal water and sewer, the applicant should be aware of that before council and reading the district's comments, because that can be quite expensive. You know, you might be talking 20K to make those connections to bring them to the new lot line. So these are things that we are trying to implement. And essentially what you would get out of that pre-con is a record, which would have a checklist where we would say what you need, and our direction on what you need comes from the OP. So the OP will say, you know, in circumstance X, you need an EIS. In circumstance Y, you need a site evaluation report. So that's where we're using our guidance on what's required, plus whatever the district says they want. Then that would go into a checklist form with a little bit of commentary from, you know, this is your designation, this is your zoning, etc. And the applicant would use that checklist to give us everything we need. They submit their application for their actual Planning Act application. We have the checklist. We go bing, bang, boom. You've got it all. Here's your notice of complete application. You didn't get it all. Your deemed incomplete because you didn't give us this. And we'll tell them what it is, and it should make the whole process much clearer and avoid some of the backlog we're facing now, where we've been dealing with applications that aren't complete but have been sitting for quite a while in the queue, and having to tell them, hey, you need an EIS, and it's just a headache for everybody involved. So we're hoping to front end the process, get everything running smoothly so that by January 1st, so the clock starts ticking when it's a complete application, when that notice goes out. So then we have everything we need and we can actually do the assessment, and the district has given us everything. So the applicant knows or can anticipate what is going to be required, and they can decide if they want to go through the studies and if they want to pay the connection fees before they even get to us for a formal application. So I hope that's kind of a long-winded way, but I just want everyone to kind of understand where we're thinking it would go. And when that clock actually starts, we should have everything we need by then.
Thanks, Jen. I want to check in with our clerk here, who has her hand up, who wants to tell us to move along.
I just wanted to make note of two things. The first thing is Member Winterhalt's comments in the chat. And then the second thing is just the time. We are at 11:11 right now, and we still have one more report on the agenda to go through by noon. So just wanted to make note of the time. Thank you.
Okay, so we probably should have some fairly brief follow-up comments on this, and we'll start with Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One question, I guess, of Jen. With respect to a complete application, if it includes, let's say, environmental impact study or fish habitat study, and that has to be reviewed, let's say, by M&R, do we get the comments back from M&R before that application is considered complete? Or is the time ticking when that study is available to the township? Because I don't know how much control you have of other agencies to sort of hold them and hold their feet to the fire in terms of the time clock.
Yeah, you've hit one of the questions that a lot of municipalities are struggling with right now is how do we be fair to the applicants while protecting the municipality financially with these fee refunds. So some other municipalities, for example, where the MTO is required to be consulted, they want those written comments before they'll deem you complete. So what I'm thinking for us is if you have a study that needs peer review, so we have a consulting agency that does that on behalf of the township, we need your final study before we're deeming you complete. So give it to us, we'll send it to consultants, they'll peer review it. You know, the two consultants will go back and forth to finalize the report. And when it's final, then you're checking that box off. Because otherwise, there's really no protection given to the municipality for this fee refund, because we're just at the mercy of review timelines for other agencies.
Thanks, Jen. Beth, you want to?
Thank you.
Yeah, sort of around the same idea. And maybe something can be considered in this manual as it relates to the seasonality or the seasonal appropriateness of the studies. For instance, in my business, we have to do amphib studies 3 times a year because there's different amphibians at different times of the year. If somebody comes forward in the end of October for pre-consultation and you say you need a species at risk study, they can't go out and do that in November. That is not the time that you find the turtles basking on the rocks. They're in the muck and they're hibernating. So I think there needs to be some consideration about the seasonality of the studies. As I say, you don't do a species at risk study in November. You're looking at turtles because you're near a wetland potentially. Really, you should be doing that in early May. April, May is probably the ideal time. So, and that kind of dovetails into the whole idea of the site visit and is it appropriate to advance some of these environmentally sensitive applications in the wintertime when you have no idea what the impact is going to be because you don't really see or understand what the site is all about. So maybe there's an element of what is the appropriate timing to conduct these studies, as well as is the study, somebody could just say, okay, I've got a report and I've submitted my environmental impact study and you've ticked a box to say it's complete. But if it doesn't meet your requirements, it's not complete. Therefore, what deems a report acceptable to be part of a complete application?
Yeah, Beth,
because there's some pretty shoddy reports I've seen, you know, across the GTA that shouldn't have been acceptable, and things like that should not necessarily satisfy the tick box for a complete application just because they want to get a clock started. Yeah, so you raise a good point. Our manual right now, our environmental consultant filled me in on when each of the studies can be done. So for example, fish, middle of summer, breeding birds, end of May, end of June. So we have that information for us and we'll be advising applicants. So right now the process is you submit an EIS, all of them are subject to peer review by the environmental experts the township has hired. And we rely on those experts to tell us if it's acceptable. And they go through and, you know, provide their peer comments and it goes back and forth. So right now it's not township staff making that determination if it's complete, it's the experts in that respective field. So the environmental stuff is what we get most often. Quite a few of our applications require one, just the nature of Georgian Bay. And we have that protection in place currently, and we're
going to propose to keep it that way. And only when we get that final study signed off by everybody do we check that box.
So that's when the peer reviewer says it's fine, that's when the clock starts ticking on that item. Okay, that's good.
Okay, so we do need to move along. I just wanted to summarize where we are so far. We've had two topics really of discussion, one being what is the definition of a complete application, and we've been having a lot of good conversation there. The second was really dealing with the site plan approval and the delegation needed for that. I have lots of comments that I would like to make, but I'm not going to make them here because we have run out of time. And perhaps I can dialogue with Jen or Jason on this later, but suffice it to say, we have a bylaw in our township that may be unique. And the bylaw basically says for commercial properties that are asking for a site plan change, that is something that has to be made public prior to it coming to the township for decision. And one of the reasons for that is a commercial property that is entertaining changes is going to have a huge impact to a large community in the township. And therefore, there should be at least an opportunity for the community to be informed of the requests for change, whereas a small residential site plan change is likely going to be fairly small, very low impact to the neighboring community, hopefully, Anyways, with all of that said, we can come back to that later, but Jason, are you going to drive the next discussion of the approach to lift holds?
Yes, Mr. Chair. We'll certainly provide an overview to the report and would look to Planning Committee to drive the rest of the conversation with us through their feedback. But so the second report that Planning Committee has on its agenda this morning provides committee with some information on sort of a subject that has been to committee before, and that is the municipality's approach with respect to lift hold requests on vacant patent lots on undersized islands within the bay. And the report, I think itself builds on several, I would sort of say, discussions at Planning Committee historically, and certainly since JLR has been retained by the township to assist with land use planning matters. And without going through all of the details of the report, so it sort of basically describes the township's existing approach and some of the limitations associated with the township's existing approach. The report acknowledges, obviously, that since the official plan and the zoning bylaw have come into effect and the township generally has developed some experience with implementing that framework, that there's a different set of expectations for, I would sort of say, development standards or the approach to development in that context within the township. So what the report does basically presents two options that we intend to bring forward to council to get some feedback and some direction on in terms of how council would like to proceed with sort of approaching these sort of lift hold requests moving forward in the future. And as we've described in the report, the first approach would be for council. Clearly, there's a desire from council and from committee and others to understand more information about an island prior to development beyond where the high water mark is. And that can be achieved by changing the criteria that are required to be achieved prior to the H being lifted itself. And that's described in the report. The second option, which we sort of also described and through some of our sort of conversations, would be this notion of actually going out and downzoning all of those places within the bay to remove any development permissions which exist today. And if anyone looking to create development on an island, undersized island in the bay moving forward, would come forward and have to proceed by way of a zoning bylaw amendment that would be subject to the process that we've just sort of talked about, pre-consultation, the submission of studies, a review and evaluation, and a site, if I could use the term, a site-specific zone category being applied to that undersized island, if it is appropriate to allow development within that space. So, Mr. Chair, this is something that has been discussed by Planning Committee quite substantially in the past. We certainly recall all of those discussions, but we're very curious to get Planning Committee's feedback on the two options that we've described in the report, both the pros and the cons. And we'll obviously be carrying that feedback forward with us when we present this matter to council for consideration. Thank you.
So if I could jump in here, I did want to pick up on one statement that you made here, and it's on page 12 of 13 of our package. And it's the second last paragraph, and you talk about the expectations for development on vacant islands, that council's attitudes or approaches have changed. Our goals and expectations for development have changed. And what I wanted to highlight is, and it came to me very late, but Beth dug up a report from 1993 from the Island Committee review. So we had an island committee back then in 1993. And they were discussing some of the issues and concerns coming out of 1991, that zoning bylaw. And I just wanted to point out that if you read, and you can't right off the top here, but if you read that document, I would say that there are no changes in goals and expectations for development on vacant islands since 1991. But we have battled this topic ever since 1991. And I think you've probably also heard that we've, from the beginning of this term of council, there have been councilors, not me, but other councilors who have been hounding at the fact that we have this outstanding item that has never yet been dealt with respect to these vacant islands. And we really haven't made much progress on them. So, Beth, did you want to elaborate on this report that you found? I'm putting you on the spot, you know.
No, I guess to the chair's point is these are not new concerns, and I guess and I don't know, it dates back to OPA 6, and I can't find in the archives what OPA 6 was as originally drafted and how it was ultimately appealed or approved. But it certainly generated a ton of appeals in this whole process to look at how to define vacant islands and, you know, when they should or should not be developed. And interestingly, back then, there was certainly a requirement for a site evaluation report. So the things that are in your official plan are there appropriately, and it has been a concern. Sorry, I'm going to just, my dog is barking in the background, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, that's on mute. Any other members want to weigh in on this? Peter.
Yeah, I just have a question. Do we know what number of islands we're talking about here? Just to give us a sense of the size of the issue. The reason I ask is I pretty carefully went through the zoning map yesterday, and I could not identify any properties in the Go Home Bay area that have the H2 designation. And I also looked at Wawatasi, with which I am less familiar, but again, through the zoning map, didn't see any properties there that have the H2 designation. So I assume this is an issue in Cognisheen and Honey Harbor area. Do we know how many islands we're talking about?
Jason, Jen, do you know?
For this one, Mr. Chair, I'll defer to Jen on this one.
No, Peter, in short, we don't know. The reason you wouldn't have seen the H2 on the schedule is because it, at the end of the bylaw, there's a little textual reference for the H's that says H2 applies to all vacant islands. So it's not mapped on the schedules, it just default applies, which makes it very difficult to do the analysis you're looking at. But that's something that we've flagged that we need to do as we develop this process more clearly, is understand how many vacant islands are there out there, where are they, how many applications like this are we getting a year. We want to do all that analysis, but we just haven't had a chance yet. And part of that might be actually putting the H2 on the islands, because right now a lot of applicants don't even know what applies until they come in for a building permit. And then they're told, oh wait, you're a vacant island. did you read this little subsection that tells you that you have a hold provision on you? So it's something that's on our radar as well.
So if I could offer just a tidbit here, Councillor Cooper and I spent a fair amount of time with the planner we had back in 2018, 2019, and we created a spreadsheet of a fair number of islands with islands and properties that were candidates for reconsideration based on whatever zoning issues, develop, not develop, whatever. I don't think that information has been completely lost. I'm sure Councillor Cooper and I could regurgitate it at some point in time, but I don't have it handy in front of me. But I'll just offer that out there, that as you're, I know we can't finish that conversation off today with those details, but I would offer that there's actually a lot of information out there that has already been gathered that may have not been handed forward. Beth,
Yeah.
is your dog quiet now?
Yes, I was just going to say it's not just islands and vacant islands. It applies to vacant lots on subdivided islands. And it should apply, if it doesn't, and there's some gray area here, it should also apply to undersized vacant lots of record that are on the mainland that are water access. Because, for instance, there's a whole bunch of narrow channels throughout the communities where you have lots on one side that are on an island, and you have lots on another side that are on mainland, and they're very close and they should totally relate to each other. So it's not reasonable that something on an island has an H2 provision, but the same vacant undersized lot of record on the mainland across from it does not. They all should be going through the studies. And I sat on planning committee when this H2 provision came into place. And it was a recommendation of Jamie Robinson at the time, because there was no H2 hold in bylaw 9119 that I was ever aware of. And his explanation to us at the time was that there are older lots there were patent lots that were created, that could have been the 50s, 60s, 70s, well before there were land use policies in our township in place, well before any environmental regulations were ever with the province. PPS statements didn't exist. And it was his feeling that these undersized vacant lots of record, and I don't remember it specifically saying it's islands. To me, it was every vacant lot, whether it's an island, whether it's a lot on an island or a lot on the mainland. If it is undersized to what the current criteria is, and it didn't go through a planning process at the time it was created, it should have all of the appropriate studies now to determine suitability for a septic, suitability for access, determination that there's no risk for endangered species or species at risk. So that is what I recall as when this came about. But there's a very good question about, how many lots there are throughout the township. And the only thing that I know is that Member Grigatis at one point said that there were 100 of them in Honey Harbor. So somebody has a tally of them somewhere. Too bad Member Grigatis is not on the call today, but there were a lot of them, and many of them considerably undersized. Personally, I think there was an oversight in the zoning bylaw, because there's policies in the official plan that speak to site evaluations being required. The purpose of the survey in determining whether it met a certain threshold is only for it to be considered for development, not that it's appropriate for development. And I think the Cognizine policies have it a little bit better than perhaps all the other communities, and it's not in the parent waterfront policies in ROP, but the threshold of the minimum lot area was only to be considered for development. And that's all that got into the zoning bylaw. You shall do a survey, and if it's over X area and frontage, then you can develop. That was never the case. The understanding was that puts you in a category to be considered for development. Then you have to do the environmental evaluation report, which may be impact studies, species at risk studies, a number of things to determine the appropriateness of the development. And I think what we've been missing, and I'm really happy that this is on the agenda, is that we've been missing that extremely important step of determining appropriateness for development. Just because it's an undersized lot created without any criteria doesn't mean it's suitable for development today. It needs to go through the same scrutiny that a consent application would or a plan of subdivision would. Sorry for the background noise. Between phone and dog, I'm challenged here, sorry.
Actually, that noise doesn't come through, so you're in good shape. But thank you for that. Can we move on to Paul?
In my understanding, this topic is going to be on their next council agenda, and I guess we also got some we'll get some feedback from closed session on this whole issue, so we'll wait to see what happens there. But presently, the H2 holding provision is only for a survey on these islands and lots and so on. And until we redefine what H2 can stand for, I think that's all we can do now is basically lift it when there's a survey done. I think if we move forward as to redefine what H2 is, and I guess I won't be around at the time that decision's made, but I'm somewhat reluctant to say that it would require an environmental study or a bunch of other expensive studies, because if you do the survey and then you do all these environmental studies and then you come back and find out the survey, you know, the lot's not big enough. So you wasted a lot of money. So I think the idea of maybe adding a component of some kind of a building envelope that once you do the survey, you also have to have a building envelope on the property for the building itself, and maybe well, obviously a septic system. I think that could be the criteria for lifting H2. But to add on an environmental study and all kinds of other expensive studies, I think that's a second phase of looking at the potential for development on a lot, and that can be done through the site plan process and so on. So that's kind of where I stand on it. And again, I probably won't be around when the final decision is made, but I think right now the survey is insufficient to lift it, and I think just to have some kind of a building envelope would make it a lot easier to understand.
Beth, you were...
Sorry, you're saying a survey is sufficient to lift the hold, is what you're saying?
Well, basically based on the existing definition. And I'm saying the definition should be improved to add a component of a building envelope in future. But right now, legally, I think all we can do is lift it after a survey. Anyway, we'll be getting some advice on this at the next council meeting, but you have to go with existing definitions, and you can't change the definitions unless it's approved by council.
It's in the basement.
So if I could add something else, Chair, in Cognachine, there is a specific policy to Councillor Wienko's point. There is a specific policy for undersized lots that to do the survey to determine it qualifies to be considered, and then the site evaluation study is to determine appropriateness for development. So that for anything in Cognachine, the site evaluation report is required, and also the lifting of a hold is on an undersized lot, and it needs to be accompanied by a zoning bylaw amendment application to recognize the undersized area and frontage. And if you look at your official plan policies, rezoning applications, there are requirements in there for evaluation reports. So I think what's been happening is we've been missing a very important step in the past, and I think a couple of appeals have brought that to light. And I'm very was delighted to actually read the decision on the Moreau application, and maybe that's something that needs to be circulated to all of the members of this committee in terms of some lessons learned from that process. And there's various other pieces of the puzzle. I heard Councillor Wienko say, well, let's put all that to the site plan stage. You can't put environmental study requirements as a condition of a rezoning through a site plan application, because the fact of the matter is, once you've lifted a hold, freeze that lot to recognize its undersized area and frontage, the chief building official is obligated to issue a permit if somebody comes forward and it complies with your minimum front yard, rear yard, DFA, all of the other base provisions in the zoning bylaw, there's nothing that, and the CBO can't say, oh, well, you now have to do an environmental studies to determine there's no species at risk. The horse is out of the barn at that point. It's too late to put those studies, and it's not appropriate that you actually put those studies as a requirement under Section 41 of the Planning Act. And I think before any decisions are certainly made on a process going forward, everybody has to have a complete understanding of what the requirements are and what the latitude is or is not under Section 41 of the Planning Act and site plans. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. I've also said that in evaluating appropriateness of a site for development, it's, as I say, addressing, can a septic be accommodated? Can you get access? And the access question, there's a very important part that we haven't dealt with yet, and that is what defines a navigable waterway? So there are many parts to this. I don't think it's an easy fix. Maybe we need time to study this and all of the various pieces and that we have in the toolbox to help manage it.
Thank you, Beth. Ian, you were up with your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is to our planners, or consultants. You're presenting us two options, option one and option two. Option two sounds like you're looking at sort of downzoning all of those sort of H2 properties to then put them through the process of a rezoning application, which would then trigger those environmental assessments and studies to determine whether the lot is appropriate for development. What would be your suggestion to the township to sort of provide, I think, the smoothest, I think, way of one is protecting, I think, the community from development on lots that should likely not be developed or need further study for development. I'm not sure why I. Can anyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Case in point, I'm the chair of the Georgia Bay Land Trust, and we have a lot beside, it's the Wabano Point Reserve that has an H2 holding provision in place. I don't think they've yet sort of applied to lift the hold, but we've demonstrated through sort of aerial photographs as well as a letter to council that under low water conditions, we have essentially a dry land meadow in front of the lawn. So if you lift that hole and you give permission for development, you then open the opportunity for that owner to dredge in front of our property, as well as great, I think, means of action. Really, I think we have to look at how we can protect not only the rights of the owner of the underside, but also protect the environment, given the fact that we are a UNESCO biosphere reserve. It's very, I think, challenging sort of undertaking, but it's something that we have to look at, and it's got to be done right. We have to do what we can to make sure that any of these undersized lots are appropriate for development, regardless of whether it takes away the rights of the from them.
Thank you, and just if I could build, I'm going to turn things over to either Jason or Jen in a moment here. But if we build from what Ian is saying, where we have concerns, you've presented us a couple of options, and we're kind of looking for clarity on what could be the easiest, simplest path forward to reflect the kinds of environmental concerns and defend, if you will, the number one strategy of the township being protecting the environment. How do we quickly but simply get to a point where we can ensure that H2 holds, which, by the way, H2 is the only hold that has a trivial condition, and there are many who seem to believe that it was a mistake based on when it was created, that it didn't have all of the rigors that other H conditions have. But what is the fastest path and best path forward for us at this point in time?
I'm happy to begin. I see that Greg has his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. If I may just jump in here. So the fastest and most efficient path is going to be discussed at council in closed session regarding this decision. As council knows, council who's present here right now. And in the longer term, especially with new council, the intent is to review our OP and our zoning bylaw and take into account council's desire. Obviously, number one, the environment is paramount. And so we want to make sure that any interpretation that may exist right now in our zoning bylaws and in our OP are actually taken care of next year. So it's gonna cost a bit of some resources and money, but in my short time that I've been here, it's clear that we need to be as objective as possible in how we direct staff in implementing our various zoning bylaws.
Paul?
Yes. Ian.
Or sorry, Alan, can I just sort of add, is there a mechanism that we could, or the township could put in an interim control bylaw until I think council has the right path to sort of dealing with these underside lots? But what I don't think we want to see is a flood of applications coming in to council that is asking for the lifting of that hold. And if there's very few provisions in place to prevent from those holds being lifted, we really, I think, are getting nowhere. So I guess my question is, can we put an interim control bylaw on those H2 properties quickly as we're trying to figure out how best to deal with these properties and their suitability for development?
Jason, Jen, could you offer comments on that?
Well, I think to build on sort of the points that have been made earlier, but to come back, I think, to what Greg had just sort of said. Beth had talked earlier about various tools in the toolbox and using all of the tools that we have available to us to achieve council's strategic desire in a fair and sort of reasonable way. And it sounds like the report that's coming to council will address many of these questions. Having been involved in many similar discussions like this, I would sort of suggest to committee that we're trending into sort of legal territory here, and those types of discussions are best discussed by council in closed because they reflect the municipality's legal strategy around some very important community building questions. So I think there's a different mechanism, if you will, for this conversation. And it looks like that mechanism is going to happen in very short order, but certainly appreciate, it's not to sort of short circuit the discussion, we appreciate the feedback. And I think it's important for both us and staff to hear this feedback as well. But just wanting to introduce that caution in the mix.
So let me kind of just expand on that just a little bit. So let's pretend that we had legal advice that said we should make changes to the H2. No matter what the legal advice is, there is a planning process that we would have to go through. And that planning process would require a public process as well, because you can't change OP statements or bylaws without a public process. And I think if I can read between the lines and what Ian is suggesting, and I don't know if there's a broad interest in this from the committee, but the idea of an ICB takes the pressure off the planning department, as I understand it, to put things into or suspend things so that we are not faced with, say, one meeting or two meetings to come to an appropriate outcome, but we in fact give ourselves multi-months to weigh in on and come up with the best solution for this. I'm just wondering, from your planning expertise, can you suggest to us, in the absence of an ICB, and let's assume for a second that we wanted to head down some path to make changes to the H2, what would be the minimum time window that we would be faced with?
So thank you for the clarification, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to do my best to kind of walk the different sort of lines of sort of conversation here. The chair is correct. So interim control bylaws, planning committee knows, it effectively represents a pause, so the municipality can undertake a study and with the goal of putting sort of new rules in place. But as we've talked around this table many times before, and certainly as we mentioned in this report, the waterfront policy review that we were talking about earlier in the year, when we were talking about that study, we were looking at a 6 to 9 month time frame to complete that study, which was actually going to look at the approach for these sort of lift holds. At that time, we were supposed to be in and around this time, actually this year, providing some advice and some recommendations to committee and ultimately to council to make some land use planning changes that sort of better reflected, I would sort of say, the understanding that I'm kind of hearing around the table and council's strategic goals for the community. So that process, again, 6 to 9 months for some sort of study. Greg had mentioned earlier an official plan review and a zoning bylaw amendment. An official plan review process can take many months to complete, upwards of 12 to 18 months, depending upon the scope of the work that's ultimately approved by council. And then usually those recommendations are presented to council, and then the legislative process would sort of kick in terms of the decision being made and the notice of decision and then the notice of appeal period. So typically that would add sort of another 3 months to the process. So there is time, as planning committee knows, that I'm often fond of saying all good planning conversations take time. So any planning study that would be undertaken to look at this or any other question in the township would definitely take at least 6 to 9 months to complete, I would suspect.
So
does that answer the question, Mr. Chair? Or?
It does. It's kind of what I expected, because I have had asked that type of question before and gotten similar answers. So consistency sometimes is a good thing. I guess one of my frustrations.
No surprises.
One of my frustrations, and this is from conversations with other members of the committee and other members of the community, there is, when we see that the H2 criteria is extremely weak compared to all the other H criteria, one has to conclude what some people are telling us, and that is this was a quick fix back in the creation of that the last set of bylaws and so on, thinking that it would solve a problem. And I guess in hindsight, it didn't solve the problem. The problem still exists. And I guess there are many people who would believe that given that it was a quick, hasty thing last time, going forward with a quick resolution, trying to fix it this time may not be the right strategy. And in fact, implementing a structure that gives us, say, a time window of, I don't know, 6 to 12 months or whatever to do it properly could make a lot of sense. Could you comment on that?
I will. It's difficult for me to sort of comment on the first part of that statement around haste, because I wasn't involved, and I'm also a firm believer in the legislative principle that council, in making policy and legislative choices, is making fully informed choices around what's appropriate for the community at any sort of given particular time, given the issues that they're experiencing, the strategic outcomes they're trying to achieve, or the context that they find themselves in. I think as an outcome of this discussion, I've learned something new today. I've been involved in several lift hold discussions, either listening or actively participating since coming on as a consultant. And I may be experiencing faulty memory, but the 1993 and the 1991 report that you've mentioned, Mr. Chair, and Beth has mentioned as well, I think as an outcome of this meeting, we would very much like to see that report, so we can understand some additional context, because that's going to inform, I think, the advice and the recommendations that we bring forward to council from a land use planning perspective. Beth had mentioned OPA 6 as well. So we'll be sort of digging through our files on our end to begin to sort of understand that. You know, every planning rule that's in effect across the province of Ontario today is there. In understanding that rule, you know, we often have to look to context and the intent that council was trying to achieve at the time. So planning committee, this is why we wanted to bring this here today. Planning committee has put new information on the table with us, which we appreciate. I think we've got a little bit of homework to do on our end from a land use planning perspective, and we'll continue to coordinate that work with Greg and his team, and look forward to having, I think, a further discussion with council on this, and perhaps further discussions with planning committee as well, Mr. Chair.
So an ask and an offer, I'd ask that if you do find OPA 6, could you share it with us? We have looked and not found. And secondly, I can share the Island Committee report, or you can, Beth. How would you like to handle that?
Well, I can't remember even how I got my hands on this report. As I say, it was dated July 16th, 1993. There are some hand strikeouts on them, and I don't know where they're from, so I don't know whether this was a draft report, but it was appeared to be making recommendations. As I say, it was as a result of some appeals to OPA number 6 and amendments at the time to bylaw 1991, which was intended to give some flexibility on minimum island size, it appears. And it says, this report says, however, it was being interpreted to allow significant variation from the minimum lot size, and the policy was being construed, which is unfortunate, so that the island development had no bottom limit for size. So I would be very interested to know, too, who the appellants were. Were they individuals who had smaller lots that, you know, obviously they wouldn't have been appealing it if it was giving them flexibility. So I suspect it was the community that was concerned about the development of some extremely undersized islands. And this was dealing with islands, but in the report, and there's something struck out as well, is it also wanted to talk about lots on islands and whether the scope was narrowed or whatever. So there's a lot of research to be done. It might give us a history. It also partially tells us where the minimum threshold came from. And there's some very mysterious things about it. So it talks about 1 hectare minimum area above the 177.0. This is just islands. 0.8 above the flood elevation of 177.4, and 0.4 hectares above the flood, sorry, high water mark was 177.4, and 0.4 above the flood elevation. 0.4 is extremely small compared to Cogmachine, Go Home, Wawatasi's minimums. And that appears to now be embodied in our official plan as the threshold to whether a lot is considered for development. Through then you need to do the site evaluation report. So what isn't here is when they determined a minimum frontage of 60 meters as being a qualifying factor to be considered for development. So there's obviously some additional work that happened, maybe recommendations to council made subsequent to this island committee. But my first reaction, and I've always wondered this, is where did the 60 meters and 0.4 hectares come from? Because that is not in keeping with the character of Cogmachine, not in the keeping with the character of Go Home, as Peter Folds will say. And certainly if there was somebody with Wawatasi, they would say a 60-meter frontage is not appropriate for a vacant lot of development, a record to be developed. So, you know, maybe the ICB is the way to go to give us some time to research some of this history. As I said, as the chair said earlier, this is not a new concern. So this has been something that's been lingering for a long time. And maybe now is the time to fix it. But I did say, and earlier, is having sat on the planning committee when I believe this H2 came into place, because it was Mr. Robinson at the time was the one that recommended this H2 provision for the reason that these lots needed to be studied to determine if they were appropriate for development. How that very critical aspect didn't get into the zoning bylaw as it did with, as you noted, all the other H holds, I don't know. And I don't even know what the other H holds are relative to. But something was amiss. What ended up in the bylaw is not consistent with what the director at the time was talking about doing.
So sadly, our timekeeper is going to cut us off here in a second. Jen, do you have a quick comment? Quick.
Yes, I was just going to read Bill's comments that he direct messaged me, because I think his internet, I see his hand is still up.
Okay.
Bill, did you want me to read them if your internet is still? Okay, I'll read them.
Yes, Jen, sorry, I meant that to be for everybody, that comment.
That's what I figured. That's why I thought I would read your comments. So your voice is out here. So Bill says, I favor option 2 on the basis that the holding approach should not be used in situations like undersized islands that won't ever meet minimum size or navigable access requirements, in brackets, i.e., a study will never be able to confirm adequate lot area because it is permanently too small, close bracket. A holding approach in such situations just offers false expectations, leading to extra pressure to ignore or work around OP policies. A study needs to identify such islands so they can be rezoned for no development. Peter's idea of an interim control bylaw to highlight the issue and provide time for the study, bracket, before more horses leave the barn, close bracket, makes sense to me. End quote.
So, Sydney, I know we are 2 minutes out, but do you want do you think we should put a resolution recommending an ICB to council, or do our planners hear the recommendations loud and clear, and we, given that we're not going to meet again till next term, is that sufficient, or how would you like to? Okay, so Jen is saying she recommends option 2 with a I'm not reading the whole thing here. Wait a second.
Can I make a further comment, Chair?
Yes.
Just so my understanding is that we've had about 2 a year, and there were 4, as I recall, on the July council agenda. Member Grigatus is a realtor, so it's interesting that he is aware of how many. None of us have the answer, but where they are or how many of them. But he's aware that there are 100 of them, or there's certainly a lot of them. I think there is a legitimate concern about a flood of applications if we don't do something about this. And we've got a very good decision here with the Moreau decision that tells us that our process, of which the way we've been going about this so far, is perhaps flawed. We need time to fix it. And I would be very happy to, as a committee, support a resolution for an interim control bylaw. It doesn't need to be in place for a year. As we've heard, it could take 6 to 8 months. And maybe it's the prudent way to go here.
So, Sydney, I'm putting you on the spot here, a quick resolution, somewhat leveraging what Bill has provided here, of we tending to favor option 2, but an ICB to give us time to properly study and report back with recommendations. Jen, is your hand still up? No. Okay. Hopefully it can be a really short
Yeah, just give me one moment.
Watching those fingers fly.
Oh, shoot.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
Sydney's preparing the motion. I would just like to make a couple comments. One is to thank Councillor Wienko for his years of service to the Township of Georgian Bay. It's very much appreciated coming from a political family. I know the commitment it takes to sort of support anyways, thank you, Paul. And I guess I'd like to congratulate both yourself, Mr. Chair, and your worship in terms of you'll have some time this fall to recharge the battery and start a new session of council in January, which we all look forward to lots of good things to come out of.
Thank you, Ian.
I copied the whereas statements directly out of the report. I don't know what's relevant or what's not relevant, but take a look and throw some suggestions out.
But I've done a quick scan, seems reasonable. Thank you, Sydney, for doing that. Are we all speed reading, or do we need another minute to consider?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Looking at that, I thought that we should have to
We've lost you, Bill.
Option 2 from the report.
Sorry, we got option 2 from the report. What? Try again.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm just saying, should the resolution identify our choice of option 2?
Okay. So Sydney, if we could resolve that council recommends considering option 2 and an interim control bylaw for zone. And option 2 and?
Yeah, I'm just reading the option 2 in the report. I'm wondering if I should put
Peter, did you want to say something? Well,
yeah, I'm not sure if, are you ready for comments on the resolution?
sure, go ahead.
My current thinking on this is the idea of an interim control bylaw was not on the agenda or addressed in the report that we received from the planners. We don't seem to have a good handle on the numbers of property number of properties that are going to be affected by this or where they are. And if I understand from the earlier discussion, there is going to be a discussion in closed session at the next council meeting on this issue. And for all of those reasons, my inclination at this point is to abstain on this motion. And I'm happy to hear any other discussion that other members have, but that's my thinking at the moment.
Beth? Can't hear you. You're on mute, Beth.
There, sorry. If I can comment on the motion, is that appropriate at this point?
Sure.
It says that whereas the limitation of the existing zoning requirements has placed staff in a position of having to utilize other planning mechanisms such as site plan control to ensure that appropriate studies are completed, a common practice for Ontario municipalities. I don't think that's the case, because site plan control does not allow you to require environmental studies. So that resolution, while it may have been utilized by the township in the past, it's not an appropriate solution and through which to address the study. So I don't like the fact that this is saying this is common practice. We need to investigate or determine that it isn't a suitable practice to punt those to a site plan stage, for the reasons I said at the very outset.
So, Bill, would you be okay if that second whereas clause was removed?
Yes, you know, that is it. I guess my main point was islands that are undersized are permanently undersized and are going to stay having any development potential. And I think alluding to things that are a bit sketchy, trying to use site plan control in the manner that we're hoping we could, but really.
Okay. So you're breaking up there, and just before we have other comments here, the intent of this kind of resolution would be directional. Obviously, council will either listen or not listen to it, but Greg, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hazelton. I'm cognizant of the time, you know, for staff and our consultants and committee, obviously, but just want to say we're trying to skin a cat here before the cat has even been presented to council via legal. So my thought is council needs to hear the legal township legal review of this case, and then take it from there. That's my that's just a comment I wanted to make, just furthering committee member Foles's comment also.
Bill, are you trying to comment or no?
And just move straight to the resolution.
So skip the whereas and go straight to the resolution. Okay, so we have a resolution that's been modified. We now either need to vote on it, withdraw it, or Beth, comments.
It's not just H2 zoned islands, because there are H2 zones on lots on subdivided islands. So you could just generally capture it by saying vacant undersized lots of record with an H2 hold provision.
Are you okay with what?
I know that because there was a lift hold on a lot on Burnt Island last summer. So it is lots on islands. It's not just standalone islands.
Okay,
so
Sydney has changed it to H2 zone properties. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we need to wrap up today's session. So unless there's any more urgent comments, I'll call a vote, and then we can move to adjourn. So can I have a mover for this? That would be Ian. Seconder, that would be Beth. And all in favor? 1, 2. Bill, what's your vote? I see your hand up. Is that
in favor?
So that's 3, and I'll go with a 4. And we'll call that carried. Okay. So the final step of process today is that we will resolve that the planning committee does now adjourn at 12:11. And this will be the last meeting, so there will be no call of the chair. It'll be our final meeting of the planning committee. And
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Sorry, a question. Did we need some form of resolution on the previous item or not?
It was predominantly for information. You know, we could pass a resolution that we've received it for information and discussion.
We don't need to pass.
That's what I'm thinking.
But
We don't need to pass a resolution for it, and we've already adjourned now, so.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
In that case, I will thank you all for your contributions, and I would ask that you do put your name forward for the new planning committee that will be invited in the December-January time period. And with that, I will thank you all very much. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.